Welcome, friends, to another episode of the Merry Corncrakes, the podcast affiliated with the Corncrake magazine. Go to corncrakemag.com where you can find stories written by classic authors and independent writers in our sphere today. It has been 1 year since the launch of the Corncrake, and today we have a very special guest, in part to celebrate that, in part to kind of get to the roots of why stories are important. Let me introduce Dave Green, the Distributist. Hello, Dave. How are you doing, sir?
Great to be here. No, I'm a huge fan of the magazine. I became a paying supporter, I think, sometime
Mm.
last month, but I'm really eager to see projects like this launch. So, I'm eager to see what you guys produce in the future, and here's to many returns on this anniversary.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for making the time to do this conversation. I guess partly what inspired me to invite you is you did a speech a few years ago at a Shieldings event in America, and I can't remember the exact title, but it was something like ghost dancing or something
Mm.
to do with that concept that you've developed. But about halfway through that speech, you go on to talk about why you think we need to develop more stories or develop new kinds of stories within our communities. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about. I mean, do you still share that view,
Oh
or
yeah.
yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really, I'm in the middle of kind of an essay on the death of storytelling in the Western world. I just went on
Mm,
way too long. It's like in part 3 right now. But, part of the difficulty we're having right now, there is sort of a crisis of n- sort of narrative quality in the West right now, where basically the stories of the 20th century don't mean anything anymore. And it's really up to us to find something that makes more sense in the modern world. And I don't exactly know the right way to do this. Like, no one really knows what the proper way to tell stories for the 21st century is. But I can tell you who doesn't have it, and that's Hollywood and anyone who's publishing
mm,
in the mainstream press these days. I go into a bookstore and it's just covered with all of this YA and romantasy stuff. And I'm somebody who likes young adult fiction, or I used to, I guess, when I was a young
mhm.
adult, as much as the next person. But this, it just feels so tired. Everything is exhausted, and the distance, the sort of right wing or the distance sphere that we have is good at criticizing, but it hasn't really cut its teeth on genuine storytelling. And even with my own kind of schizophrenic writing style, I've been kind of drawn to even argumentative essays that have a narrative quality to them more and more, because I feel it's more relevant in what we're really trying to discover in the modern world.
I mean, I guess one question I have then is, so you've mentioned the stories of the 20th century. What did you have in mind with that, and how then how have they become exhausted?
Well, I mean, the story of the 20th century, it's a complicated question. I mean, obviously there are a lot of stories that are very relevant from the 20th century, but like the story of the 20th century is always some variation of like World War II.
Mm,
It's like there's an oppressive force, and the oppressive force is holding down the spirit of individual liberty and democracy, and then it's overthrown by a hero who restores the balance, which is some variation of liberal democracy and individual expression. Think like Harry Potter. Like that. There's a reason why all this young adult stuff is dominant, is because and the reason why it's boring is it all tells the same story. And I'm not talking about like how everything tells the same story in terms of the hero arc. The young adult fiction genre that's dominated modern storytelling, it tells a very, how should I put it, a very constrained version of that story that's designed to fit into 20th century pieties about how individualism and self-expression are the highest order of the good, sacrifice for the collective and transcendental meeting that goes between generations is archaic and ultimately oppressive. And because of that, sort of the stories that we have always kind of fall flat. They don't really have a good way of reaching critical catharsis. People were talking today about this show called Severance, and
Mm,
this is like a dystopian sort of Philip K. Dick type story, and there's this huge buzz about it, just the same way as that there was a buzz about Game of Thrones. Now, the problem is that Game of Thrones had a really good run initially, but this is something that the author can't really resolve, was how to end on a note of catharsis that actually meant something without offending liberal pieties or seeming naive or seeming traditional. And the thing is, Game of Thrones came up with trying to deconstruct the narrative of Tolkien, and it did so by appealing to realism and then also kind of incorporating on the side a sense of tragedy. But
mm.
the problem is it couldn't resolve itself in the mode of a Shakespearean tragedy because that would involve some kind of moral lesson. And it couldn't resolve itself in the mode of a Tolkien, a Tolkienist eucatastrophe, where think like the life of the spirit is restored. And so it kind of petered out. It petered out in kind of cliche. And the same thing's going to happen for this Severance series. It doesn't have really the guts to give a truly pessimistic ending, and it doesn't have really the moral direction to give the audience some kind of understanding that of itself as being really human.
I guess I'm like the way you've described it. The kind of fundamental narrative arc sounds very much like Thomas Sowell's unconstrained vision, where human nature is Rousseauian. It's born free, but it is oppressed by society, and so the whole narrative
Mm.
is we've got to break the chains of that. And I guess part of the problem with that is it's an untrue vision of humanity. And while in the 20th century there was an ability to kind of buy into this um, illusion, now, today, we're confronted by human nature, which isn't inherently good and oppressed. Actually, there's a lot of bad sides of human nature. We're seeing that in our societies when it is let free, when it
Mhm.
is allowed to run riot. I think of, for example, when we just allow people to be on drugs and actually support that. It's
Yeah,
actually
exactly.
oppressive
That's
to
a classic
intervene,
example. Yeah.
and then you end up with these camps stretching for miles and miles of people who are high, and it just ruins them, ruins the communities around them. You can't believe in that kind of narrative anymore. It just doesn't fit with that reality. But then
Yeah.
at the same time, the postmodern kind of deconstructionist narrative, which intriguingly is kind of what our sphere is good at in terms of deconstructing things, as you were saying
Mhm.
earlier. That narrative doesn't lead you anywhere constructive. It doesn't lead to you actually intervening for those people on drugs in those camps. It just says, okay, that's there. That's what reality's like. There's no hope.
Yeah, and in many ways, the right or the non-progressive side of things essentially had to embrace postmodernism to escape the trap that it was caught in, essentially
Mm,
playing the modernist part well past modernism's expiration date and kind of being subverted by a left that didn't have to play by those rules anymore. And to kind of escape that trap, we had to develop a postmodernist sense of ourselves. But that only kind of reveals the greater spiritual deficit that lies behind that. And I'm a person that thinks sort of modernism is a necessary tribulation that we have to pass through. But the only thing that can kind of come at the end of the death of all narratives is some narrative that we actually believe in. And that narrative is going to have to be something that people are willing to sacrifice for, and it's not going to simply be a reflection of our own preferences back to ourselves. I mean, the modern progressive understanding of the universe can't offer a single thing to humanity that is worth a genuine sacrifice,
mm.
a personal sacrifice in a way that it values. And it will sacrifice things that it doesn't value and that it thinks are trivial, and it will call that sacrifice, but it won't actually concede that that freedom actually needs to be limited, that love has to be essentially the sublimation of the self to a higher power. And because of that, all of its descriptions of its own heroism are fundamentally anticlimactic. And the girl boss is a good example of this. This is sort of the trope that captured, for the last 10 years, we've been dealing with just, the complete death of mainstream action movies at the hands of this kind of trope of this like uber confident Mary Sue type character. The problem is it's a fundamentally false vision, because the hero has to find some order or power that they sort of bend a knee to in order to be perfectly whole. And the narrative of the girl boss doesn't have that inside themselves. And it becomes kind of a false vision. It becomes kind of something that isn't that doesn't ring true, and people kind of understand that the story is false when they encounter it.
And very much so. And I think one aspect of this is that the stories that seem to have had enduring quality, even if they're harnessed for a liberal progressive end, fundamentally have a strong hero character. I think of something like Batman, for example, who he's the archetypal knight in a modern setting, who is committed to seeing justice even though the whole system is against him, and he fundamentally upholds an order which isn't going to deliver justice. But he has that he has qualities which actually threaten what we have to what the liberals would want to support. But that's partly why he's so engaging. Or I think of the Lord of the Rings films, which kind of mute some of Tolkien's more troublesome aspects for today. But even then, it's still like Aragorn is going to be king. He's going to bring justice and overthrow his enemies with violence. He is somebody who pulls to it. We are drawn to, but it's been harnessed for a liberal end. And so then when you see the kind of these stories become more progressivized, like in Rings of Power, it utterly collapses in on itself. It can't sustain can't sustain it anymore. So it's still for it to work, it still relies upon the old good storytelling.
Yeah, and the Rings of Power, I didn't actually see that, but I mean, it has a fundamental cosmology problem, because Tolkien's vision is naturally constrained, and the characters of the Rings of Power don't want to be constrained. They want to be kind of like these liberated people, but that doesn't really make any sense. I mean, even the elves are constrained to kind of their own folly, right? I don't know if you're a big Tolkien fan, but I am. And I think back to the Silmarillion, right? Like it's an epic because it's the story of kind of like the elves' folly, trying to essentially like fight the in-universe version of like Satan, and falling to their own hubris, right? But like falling to your own hubris is not something that translates into the progressive understanding of the world. They can understand oppression, but they can't understand those deep flaws and the kind of deeper act of redemption. And that's what people want to see. That's what people want to hear about. And I mean, they want to hear about. It's like I'm even presenting that in a modernist term. Like they want to hear about like this is a consumer demand. I mean, that's what people like. That's the path that people's lives need to follow. And in order to tell the truth, we need to kind of describe this. And this is a problem. People say like, well, we don't really know. Like the millennial story can't really be told because the elements of it, like the seedier elements, have to be excluded. And also like some critical dimension of it hasn't been written yet. And this is why after David Foster Wallace, there hasn't been any kind of great novelist that's emerged. It's all kind of been like either genre fiction or this like very kind of standard, a New York Times bestseller kind of bait, the things that flatter the pride of the coastal elites and the people who write book reviews for major publications. And in that, like, the real story of what it means to be a millennial or of our generation, or even, of Zoomers, of younger generations, has kind of been lost. Like, we don't have the language to describe that, because it would be highly discomforting to the people who write reviews.
I think so, and I guess there's there's a couple of questions there. One is that, and the way you've been talking about the kinds of stories we need, something that describes a reality which we would be willing to sacrifice things for. Is this the kind of is it the sort of thing that we should be looking for in novels and short stories and so on, or is this really a call for a kind of renewal of a religious story, or something equivalent to that? Is it actually something that is sustained in a different way than the novel or the film, or something like that, or can we find it in fiction too?
Well, this is kind of an open question, in my opinion. I'm not so sure. There is an argument to be made that, like, in order to write a good novel or a good story, like, it needs to essentially be written for a religious audience. And we just have these religions right now that are in the process of collapsing and remaking themselves. I think, what we are seeing is going to be some revivification of some religion that is basically Christianity, or, some iteration of it. And then, like, the death of sort of the secular humanist religion of the 20th century, because this is totally incoherent. And the question, I suppose, is, are the stories we write now kind of like a prefiguration of a change, like a necessary stage in this redevelopment? Or is, the attempt to write stories, like, just too soon, too early? And there needs to be kind of like the religious change needs to happen first, and then the continuation of that needs to exist in art sometime later. And I don't think anyone should stop writing or reading. I think I've read a lot of great stuff coming from, alternative presses and in publications like Corncrakes or Passage Press, or all this stuff. And it's way better than all the stuff in the main, or way more relevant than the stuff in the mainstream. And it's refreshing. But the question is, I feel still like we're on early days, and we don't exactly know what we're doing. We're just trying different things and seeing what sticks.
I think that's fair, and it's a little bit unfair to ask you to solve, I guess, humanity's problems in an interview. But it's something that kind of has racked my mind a bit, because take somebody like Richard Wagner, who I think in his own day probably saw himself as trying to do what we're trying to do, facing a similar situation, and we maybe look back and think, okay, that time was a lot better, but for him, he thought that the German people were under attack and losing their identity in the face of industrialism, capitalism, the breakdown of traditional societies, and was trying to recover that through a return to the classic stories, the Ring Cycle, Tristan and Isolde, Parsifal, but in a new form in the opera. But he felt that religion in that period had become hypocritical. It had become something which has lost its vitality, and actually this is the only way that could be sustained is through art. And so he tried to recreate that in an artistic form, a kind of substitute for religion, or a passing over it. But this didn't really happen. Although people went to go and see the operas, it didn't necessarily shape them as a community in that respect. There wasn't a community around the opera in that way, I suppose I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's hard to know exactly what Richard Faulkner had in mind. He perfected a certain, I mean, he arguably took the idea of the opera to its logical conclusion. I mean, like his idea was like, this is going to be kind of like both a novel, like a national epic, and a play and an opera all at once, and with the cherry on top. And I mean, like this is like an epic vision and something that could really only exist in a certain time. I mean, it certainly was. I mean, if we're talking about like, I don't know, we'll never know really, because the Germany that Wagner intended to kind of be the subject of this ultra nationalistic understanding of German identity was like destroyed twice across the 20th century and scattered to the four winds. And it's hard to know what we'll make of Wagner when we look back on him. I can say that, like, one of his descendants is obviously Lord of the Rings. And I am rereading this with my wife, and it is just I mean, it's like a cliche, right? Everyone on our circles that loves Lord of the Rings and loves Tolkien, and I already mentioned it once in this thing, but it's way better. Like every time I read it, I dislike the movies more and more and more, because the critical dimensions of that with the poetry and the mythology, which is kind of the core dimension of Tolkien's work, is just it is lost in the movies critically. And the and it's hard to know what to make of it. It's hard to know what to kind of put together from the movies. But what I should say is it's something that you read, and the world that Tolkien is trying to kind of honor in terms of the Northern European shires is in the process of dying. But the vision that he lays out there is not going to die and is going to lead to something else. And is going to become a model for people's lives in a law, or a model for what is kind of valuable to preserve. And and I think similar things can be said of Wagner. Like we don't really, it's the thing that was Wagner can never be, because it's such an elaborate production and it requires like a very particular time and place and patronage. But that music, and like Tristan and Isolde or the Flying Dutchman, like that music is just, it's eternal. It will spawn infinite numbers of iterations, and those iterations will contain within them a folk life. Arguably, one of those iterations is Lord of the Rings, and so it already has happened, and we're kind of trying to create the mulch around that folk life, for something that could probably come afterwards. That might be something that it's hard to reach these things, like these high culture things from the 19th century. People need to have more accessible versions of them that are kind of stepping stones to those more aspirational jumping off points.
Well, no, I suppose the major difference is, Richard Wagner is somebody who could get the patronage of a very rich person eventually in his life, and this then allowed for his operas to be played. And a whole opera house is built for that. And J.R.R. Tolkien, okay, most of his writings actually don't get published in his life, as the Silmarillion and so on is a later thing. But the Lord of the Rings can get published by a mainstream publisher, and then gets disseminated and made into a film by a mainstream film company. Whereas most of us are now working in a place outside of the mainstream, indeed totally cut off from the mainstream in terms of storytelling and so on. So with that in mind, we're in a very different place from these people. And I know that there's a changing of the guard to some extent in America, but in Europe at least, it's very much business as usual, it seems.
That is depressing. Yeah, I agree.
So then, what, in terms of our space then, like, what practical things would you like to see happen with storytelling?
Well, I would, I would like to use the networking that we built to encourage book groups and book exchanges, and and really use those book groups to highlight authors and short stories that we create and intermix them with more classic fare,
Mm.
and then also use that to kind of, I mean, people are of different financial means. It takes a lot to buy these physical copies of books, and I'm trying to put together a small lending library, for the purposes of lending them out to other people, and not to like disincentivize people to, support our artists, but just to get, these things actually read. I mean,
Mm.
the thing is with literature, the problem with movies is people say, okay, well, Zoomers don't have the attention span for them. Um, yeah, and my friend Isaac Young, he's a writer who you might know from Twitter. He's done a lot of these kind of like novels that are sort of like better versions of mainstream fantasy, which I think are what I've read is good. But obviously, I think there's like, there's a lot of different directions you could go in other than that. But he says like Zoomers have this horrible problem with attention span. I don't know if that's the problem. The problem is like Zoomers have tons of attention span when it comes to speedrunning video games and hanging out in Discord groups. What they don't have is the understanding that like a movie is relevant or a book is relevant.
Mm.
And the problem always with a new pub is telling an audience like, okay, why should you read this? Like because you read something, you want to talk to it with people. You want to have a community of people that are actually sharing in this idea and reading about this idea and discussing the meaning of it. And I think that this is it's 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 something that I it's a missing part of the puzzle, right?
Mm.
Because in the internet age, everything seems kind of fundamentally transient. But when you're putting together these kind of more solid elements of culture, there needs to be kind of a community around that surrounds it and says like, this is valuable, this is worthwhile. Like, for instance, like some of the successes on the right have been like Bronze Age Pervert, right? Like that book was relevant because it became a touchstone for like a kind of way of thinking, even though there's
Mm.
lots of legitimate criticism that can be made of the book and has been. And the same thing for like other things like Dan Baltic and a variety of other authors like Delicious Tacos. Like these are, again, like people have tons of problems with these authors, but what set them aside and allowed, or Zero H.P. Lovecraft, what set them aside and allowed them to kind of get the space they needed was the fact that people were talking about their books and there was a discussion going on. And we need to foster that kind of discussion on books, online, but really in real life. Like that's the next step of this process. And it I don't know. We just need to kind of experiment with what this means. I don't exactly know with what this means. I
Mm.
know that perhaps our mutual friend Carl Benjamin has this this print magazine called Islander, and it's weird because it's like a Substack essays, but like published, and
Yeah.
they're good authors, right? But you're thinking like, okay, so like the article gets published in the Islander, but it becomes like this print artifact. But that means necessarily that fewer people are going to read it. But like maybe there is a relevance to that. Like it is like this elite artifact now and
Mm.
not a digital component. And that's an interesting experiment. And I kind of want to own physical copies of these things because I kind of want to know how they interact with the real world if they're introduced to the real world. I
Mhm.
know probably most of us have mostly normie friends, but how would they react to kind of being introduced to these things? It's a good question.
Well, I think it's a worthwhile thing to explore, and I know that the Corncrake, hopefully in the next year, will have a print version of it in due course. There actually was one for the Witten this year or last year, I suppose. I have it to hand actually. A
Mm.
lovely print edition of it, and it just transforms the experience being able to touch it and look at it in person and take your time going through it rather than on a screen. So I
Yeah,
think
absolutely.
in itself. Maybe there will be Corncrake reading groups. Who knows, in the next year or
Well,
so.
This is probably not the appropriate time, but I've actually yet to get one of these. Is it fiction or criticism, or is it a combination? It sounds like almost, right? Or
So the Corncrake is primarily fiction. That's in there. So it's a collection of stories from classic authors, but also authors working today. So like Isaac Young, for example, I think he's had something.
Oh, really? Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I definitely have to pick that up. And but yeah, that is actually what we would want, right? We would want exactly that kind of dynamic, that kind of combination of the classic with the contemporary. And I think it would really, it might be good if we could develop white papers for how in real life reading groups of this would go. It would be kind of interesting. I'd like to see how that would work.
Yeah, that would be excellent. Let's do that. Let's do that. I will get the editor involved, and we will have some discussions. We've come towards the end of our conversation, so I just wanted to ask Dave: is there anything that you would like to promote?
Well, I always promote community building, like the Basque Weaving Project. If you're an American, we've got a variety of organizations like the OGSA. My own stuff is like the Substack Letters from Fiddler's Green, where I am writing a essay series on literature and literary criticism, which is very long and schizophrenic, but just had to get it out there. And and then my podcast and YouTube channel, everyone knows as the Distributist, which has been there for like 10 years now. And I'm really excited to see how these cultural developments go. And I think really, especially in America, I mean, sorry, like I know you guys, I think you're in Europe or
Yeah.
If you're an American here and you're listening, like this is your, what are you doing? Not organizing during this time. This is the prime. Our enemies are totally on the back foot. You need to be getting out there, finding fellow friends in real life. The danger has never been less. I'm sorry if you're in Europe hearing this. I'm not gloating. I'm just telling our friends in America that they need to seize the day, because I think in the very near future, things might very well shift around, with Europe being the one where there's a resurgence of sort of friendly sentiment on the continent, and maybe even on the United Kingdom.
Well, thank you, Dave, for your time and for your thoughts. I really appreciate it. And thank you to you, dear viewers, for watching. Please go to corncrakemag.com and check out the stories there. And there'll be more in the future. I think April should just be around the corner when this comes out. So there'll be a new edition on its way at the start of the month. Thanks again, and God bless to you wherever you are, whoever you are. Goodbye for now.